Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that you're able to join us for another Florida Talks at Home program. I guarantee that you're going to enjoy tonight's program with Vicky Machado. I think it's going to be really fascinating talking about this intersection between water and sacred landscapes. I'm Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities. And so I'm going to be your host tonight here alongside with Vicky. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction for the program, and then I'm going to turn things over to her. So if this is your first time joining us for a Florida Talks at Home program, we're doing this because normally we work with cultural partners across the state. But obviously that can't happen right now because of COVID-19. So our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening in person once again. Now, next week's event is going to be October 21st at 6 p.m. And it's going to talk about the true story about how two separate oil tankers split in half in a 1952 storm off the coast of Cape Cod, and how Disney made a movie about that particular disaster. And so you can register for that event on our Facebook page or by going to our website, floridahumanities.org. I also want to let everyone know that we have a special event tomorrow evening on October 15th at 6 p.m. featuring Florida's Secretary of State, Laurel Lee. Secretary Lee is going to be discussing the importance of civic engagement and why being a savvy consumer of information matters now more than ever. At the end of tonight's presentation, you're going to receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would appreciate it if you could take a time to fill it out for us. If you have any questions or any sort of technical difficulties during the program, you can certainly put it down in the chat pod and we can try to work through that. And I'm also going to do a Q&A with Vicky at the end of her presentation. So that'll be the way we can integrate your questions in. If you enjoy tonight's program, I'd like for you to keep in mind that your support is essential to helping sustain these types of programs. So we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to Florida Humanities and to continue to help make these programs possible. And again, tonight we welcome Vicky Machado. She is a PhD candidate studying religion and nature at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on social movements surrounding environmental issues. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vicky.
Thank you, Keith. I am so honored to be here. I just wanted to thank Florida Humanities for allowing me to come and share my research and my deep passions for Florida's water. And I want to thank all of you for inviting me into your homes and your places where you're at, and for joining me on this hopefully exciting conversation. Yeah, it should be really interesting. So as someone who studies religion and nature, I'm going to share with you a story about water. And more importantly, it's a story about our relationship with Florida's water and how we might reimagine this resource by looking at it within the lens of the sacred. So when we think about stories, we think about this once upon a time. When we were children, we were told tons of stories about enchanted lands and worlds that existed only in our imaginations. And regardless of the story, there was a common purpose. Such narratives were used as a way to understand and to learn, and most of all, to make sense of the world. And there's a moral, there's a takeaway. It's a principle that moves us beyond the story and tells us something larger about ourselves and about our environment around us. So today, we continue to tell stories. They help us to grapple with complex issues. And most of all, stories influence how we see each other and how we see our society. Stories can be fictional and they can be non-fictional, but such collectives are telling us to look beyond ourselves. So this evening, I am going to tell you a story about Florida and its water. But I want you to understand that this is not the story of state agencies and water management districts, politicians and scientists. By and large, the current views of Florida's water have been widely contrary to the story I'm about to tell, which I hope will make it that much more meaningful. So this presentation is going to explore how we go about restoring Florida's waterways through relationships And this is not to say that state agencies and water management districts and politicians and scientists, all of the people that I mentioned, are not part of the story. They are part of the story. They're essential, as we all are essential. But this evening's story is about our collective relationship with our surroundings. It's about human nature interactions. So we'll be investigating this through those who love and advocate for these water bodies. And I hope we will dive into the conversations that arise when Floridians start to view water as essential to their quality of life. So before we start, I would like to know where you're at. What part of Florida are you familiar with? What part of the state do you call home? Are you even in the state? And I think there is a poll coming up. So thank you for those of you who put it in the chat. There's also a poll. So if you get a chance, you can write or note it in the poll. And maybe I had to participate too. So we're gonna hang on while if you haven't participated, send in your number, right? We've got a lot of people who are saying 3. We've got some 2s and 5s. West Central 2. And there we go. I'm not sure how many people are from how many different places. I didn't get the results of that, but I got the ones of you who had mentioned it in the chat, which is great. So we're all from different parts of the state. For years, we have carried the role as the Sunshine State. But for this story, I can't help but feel like we should reframe ourselves as the water state. So as many of you know, water is never far from sight. We're second only to Alaska in terms of miles of coastline. Florida is known for its pristine beaches. Inland, we've got lakes, rivers, canals, springs. They've all captured our attention as we flock to them year round. So growing up in Broward County, which is where I'm from, if the news wasn't reporting on an alligator in someone's pool, then it was often reporting on some kind of torrential downpours that were imminent in the afternoons. Or it was reporting on a pending hurricane on its way. Water was everywhere. It literally poured forth from the heavens, bringing about both joy and fear. So when I moved to Gainesville in 2007, it was at a really interesting time. I was disheartened by the lack of water because the state was in the midst of a drought that had lasted from 2006 to 2008. And I literally saw lakes just dry up. There were docks that were extending to an occasional marshy pond, or the remnants of once a thriving lake stood like sad puddles. So more recently, we've experienced another drought-like situation. As waterways were closed to the public because of COVID-19. So while the virus did not take the water away, for those of us who rely on the water as a form of recreation or sustenance, it distanced us from our waterways. But the water was still there and precious in many respects, hidden from the public eye beneath our feet in the Floridian aquifer. This was one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. And if you're familiar with the springs, the aquifer is a massive network of underground caves and waterways. And some of them are so big that a small car could fit through. It supplies the water for all of Florida. So here is my second question for you all. How many square miles would you say this system encompasses? And I'm offering a little hint down at the bottom. So feel free to offer your input. You can also do this in the chat too. Okay, so hopefully you got a chance to make your mark. And if you said 100,000, then you are correct. According to the USGS, the Floridian aquifer encompasses 100,000 square miles. So you might kind of ask like, whoa, wait a second, what about your hint, right? It turns out, especially because given the state of Florida, it turns out the aquifer extends into southern Alabama, southeastern Georgia, and southern South Carolina, while also encompassing all of Florida. So even when we're low on water, there are still tons of it. So this overabundance of water that we've seen in years since the 2008 drought has supported tourism, industry, and the growing population that in 2014 caused Florida to surpass New York in becoming the third largest state in terms of population. This overabundance has in many ways cheapened the price of water, giving millions of people the ability to turn on the tap while also watering their deeply unsustainable lawns. It has deceived us with the proclamation that there is an infinite supply for our use and our pleasure. And it's cultivated a narrative that emphasizes our use and abuse of water rather than how we interact with it and how we engage with it. So water is solely a commodity in many ways. And this narrative, this story about water has existed since early European conquest. It's the same narrative that followed us through population and development surges that built canals and filled wetlands. And the sad part is that such a narrative continues today. You can just recall from a few years ago, the sign that welcomed people to Florida stating open for business, right? Such mentalities led to deeply troubled relationships between the people of Florida and the waters of Florida. And in 2018, Environment Florida ranked our state as 10th in the nation for industries violating the Clean Water Act, citing fewer inspections of major industrial facilities and lax penalties. So these are companies like Tropicana, Mosaic Fertilizer, Coca-Cola, Pilgrim's Pride, a range of power companies throughout the state, and there are more. So oftentimes, upon hearing this information, people begin to wonder about their own water. Nestle too, thank you, Marilee. People begin to wonder about their own water. But recall, we are here talking about water within the context of the Florida Humanities, which throughout this lecture, I want to challenge you to think about what it means to collectively reimagine our relationship with water. So more specifically, I'm here to uncover my research into the spiritual motivations of environmentalists who love and advocate for these water bodies, thereby helping us to revise our interactions with water. So by focusing on issues related to springs and the Florida Everglades, we will dive into these conversations that arise when Floridians begin to see water as essential to their quality of life, when Floridians begin to see water as sacred. So I want to take you back to 2016, when South Florida experienced a series of extensive toxic algae blooms that wreaked havoc on waterways, harming marine life and severely damaging local livelihoods. Known as blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria outbreak caused lakes and canals to turn slime green, accompanied by an overbearing stench. It led state officials to declare a state of emergency in the summer of 2016. By 2017, the blooms nearly covered Lake Okeechobee, Florida's largest lake, leading to fish and marine kills on both coasts. The conditions continued to worsen, eventually leading to another state of emergency by July of 2018. Agitated by high nutrients, humans in the third largest state in the US both caused the problem through industry, agriculture, storm runoff, as well as septic tanks and rampant development, and were severely impacted by the issue as tourists and visitors kept their distance, causing businesses to feel the brunt of the impact. The sludge that brutally damaged local economies and presented a slew of respiratory problems for those living near the water caused Floridians to realize just how interconnected they are with the natural world. So during these cyanobacteria outbreaks, environmental groups and forums on social media were faced with the task of making sense of this problem in the midst of their work, figuring out how to best take action and clean up the state's most vital resource. While many groups turned to petitions and protests, a handful of individuals turned to prayer and century-old ways of understanding their relationship to water. So one such collective began viewing the state's water problems as a spiritual crisis, approaching this problem publicly through prayer, ritual, and mindfulness. Created in 2014, a handful of spiritually inclined people began regularly praying for the healing of water. So this began several years prior to the 2016 outbreaks. They recognized the importance of water, hosting monthly sacred water ceremonies consisting of rituals on beaches and banks of rivers. They were holding such events in close proximity to other water bodies, and they hoped to raise awareness about the sacredness of water while further connecting to the water through positive energy forces in an effort to promote healing. The group drew from the power of thoughts and actions in order to support restoration for both the water and the individual through the creation of a clean, loving, and peaceful planet for future generations. So much of their overall message is rooted in the power of consciousness, as explained through the Hado teachings of Masaru Emoto, a Japanese holistic healer of alternative medicine. Known by many sacred water participants as Dr. Emoto, Hado is related to the Chinese notion of qi. It links it with alternative practices that engage energy forces to promote holistic healing. In this regard, Emoto professed the importance of water and the importance of words. So essentially, he stated that water crystals can physically change based on the positive or negative words spoken to them. So sending negative energy causes water crystals to harmfully change, while sending positive thoughts and compassionate prayers helps promote clean energy. So based on this information, a lot of the people who are engaged in sacred water ceremonies, they brought this idea to their ceremonies, essentially saying that the practice of healing water and the importance of subtle vibrational energy would help with our relationship to water. So in South Florida, the sacred water ceremonies draw from Hado instruction, as well as various cultures and a range of other earth-based belief systems in order to honor and bless the water by promoting holistic spiritual healing. This is achieved through collective song, prayer, and reflection, as participants send kind words and healing energy and positive thoughts to the water. The ceremonies are now held on both the east and west coasts of Florida, and they're usually held within close proximity to a body of water in order to promote such energy connections. So prior to the start of such events, an altar is composed of sacred materials. Often crystals, flowers, shells, stones is established on the sand or on colorful blankets. Such items are arranged in a circular or spiral configuration in order to make up a mandala or a sacred geometrical pattern. These patterns lead to a large water vessel that is filled with water from usually a local body of water, which is returned at the end of the ceremony. Participants then gather in a circular formation around the outside of the mandala. Some are seated on colorful blankets, others may bring folding chairs. Another aspect of these ceremonies is the acknowledgement of the natural world. So in the case of the September 2018 Delray Beach gathering, which is shown here, the 4 cardinal directions were invoked and explained alongside their symbolic meanings. Such acknowledgements offer honor to life outside of the self. So not only are participants asked to orient themselves spatially, but they are asked to listen deeply to the natural world. Leaders highlight the songs of birds, the feel of the wind or the rush of the water. In some instances, participants are encouraged to place their hands on the ground, recognizing the connection of the self and the earth as similar living beings. So in between songs and acknowledgements of the natural world is a deep sense of respect and care. Water is viewed as sacred, as a source of life, and as the lifeblood of Mother Earth. Hado and other similar concepts offer positive vibrations and energy that is often weaved throughout the ceremony as leaders explain that water is an active agent with the capacity to record, store, and transmit information. In this sense, water is viewed as an authoritative living entity, giving it the power to impact and transform the world in which it flows. Similar to many indigenous worldviews, such animistic perspectives create a relational bond between humans and nature, uniting the two in a family-like context. So in this sense, participants gravitate towards the notion that Mother Earth cares for and loves the human, plant, and animal life within her. Such ideas follow indigenous and Gaia-like notions of the earth as alive or as mother to all humanity and all life. With these viewpoints, it's easy to see why ceremony leaders and participants alike draw parallels between water and the human body, recognizing both the planet and humans are composed of similar percentages of water. The ceremonies emphasize these connections, providing for meditative silence or silent prayers as participants take a moment to remember their reliance on water for every living process. So apart from this ceremony, local indigenous leaders host their own gatherings and draw from generational wisdom. The November 2018 Healing Our Relationship with Water was co-hosted by a Miccosukee grandmother and the co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance of Southwest Florida. It was held on the dike of Lake Okeechobee just after a rainstorm that offered some relief from the cyanobacteria fumes. So recognizing the water in a feminine lens, this ceremony looked to heal relationships with water by understanding that the water is not an enemy, but the victim. And that's the quote that comes from many of the people who participated in it. This notion that she is not the enemy, she is a victim. In this sense, water is viewed as a family member as participants listen to the guidance offered by ancestors in the natural world in order to carry out the ceremonies. So nature guides them. And broadly speaking, these rituals are more specifically, they emphasize larger themes of connectivity. Leaders and participants view the environment as holistic, and they view humanity as one part of what constitutes the natural world. In many ways, they are both within the natural world while also recognizing their own disconnection from it. Identifying such disconnections allows participants to deepen their quest to establish closer ties with the water as they find it to impact every part of life, including their own personal bodies. Such connectivity reinforces holistic understandings of healing. So while these rituals occur on a regular monthly basis on both the east and west coasts of Florida for several years, the blue-green algae that covered Florida's waterways largely impacted them. They expanded their reach as people began to recognize the importance and sensitivity of Florida's water. Many of the participants of such events don't simply recognize the changes in the environment from a spiritual realm, but they actively work towards a better tomorrow. So in other words, the participants seek a more sustainable future through their personal choices. And this might be various environmental initiatives they're involved with. Some commit to buying organic food or avoiding harsh chemicals, both for the sake of themselves and the environment. Others are in active conversation with water management districts as they push for more effective policies surrounding water. And then some have jumped into science, undergoing training to become a local waterkeeper ranger. Some ceremonies have also attracted a handful of community advocates and grassroots organizers who promote clean air and clean water in their communities through policy changes, both on a state and local level. Regardless, these ceremonies show how people are trying to reconnect to the water, and further, how they acknowledge their already existing deep connections. So on a larger level, such efforts to bridge pre-existing divides between Floridians and water remind participants that they are one part of the natural world. This is a way of reimagining the story. Viewing themselves as one part of the larger ecosystem reminds ceremony participants that it's their duty to care for other members of society, including animals, plants, natural resources, and ecosystems. Collectively, this view aims to turn the tide when it comes to understanding one's separate human nature relationships. Such outlooks are not limited to the spiritual or religious realm. Environmental groups in other parts of the state are also advocating for holistic understandings of humans and nature in order to drive their environmental campaigns and change our relationship with water. In April 2019, another separate group of about a dozen environmentalists met in Orlando to rethink human-water relationships. Many of the people who showed up had dedicated their lives to water issues, including a couple of prominent Springs advocates who are with us today on this call. So I'm really excited they're here. So I want to take you back a little bit. Springs protection peaked in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In 1999, the Springs Task Force was formed as a response to Florida's growing population and an increase in nitrate loading. It was a tremendous effort that looked to protect Florida's springs through the allocation of springs and spring sheds. Since then, state-based funding for springs protection has waxed and waned, but by and large, springs advocates agree that the state has largely neglected springs restoration. All of this came at a particularly difficult time as big projects like phosphate mines, concentrated animal feeding operations, bottled water extraction, and pipelines presented ever-growing threats and pressures to these beautiful gems. With most of the efforts to combat polluters, springs advocates experienced pushback from from both state and local politicians who prioritized industry's interests. The group that met in Orlando began to explore new ways to approach such issues when it came to the birth of the Florida Rights of Nature movement. With the help of Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, the activists joined the Global Rights of Nature movement, which secured legal rights for ecosystems, rivers, and other non-human species around the US, as well as abroad in places like Ecuador, New Zealand, and India. In these cases, such waters were protected by law. Following the larger movement, Florida environmentalists wanted their water sources to be viewed as more than just commodities for human use. They wanted water to be legally recognized by granting it the right to exist, flourish, and evolve. So early conversations spread throughout the state, and this led to at least a half a dozen groups working on ways to incorporate the rights of nature into local laws through petitions and meetings with lawmakers. Many tried to go through county charters. By 2020, groups like SafeBor met again, this time at the annual Public Interest Environmental Conference, which was hosted at the UF Law School. And this conference focused their entire gathering on the rights of nature. Having established grassroots success, the environmentalists met resistance from state initiatives looking to suppress their efforts. So as one environmental leader told me, quote, "It took 8 years for Ohio to pass an anti-rights of nature bill. It took 8 months down here. This is the new vanguard of environmental action," end quote. So through the rights of nature movement, though the rights of nature movement is not necessarily spiritually or religiously driven, such initiatives align with sacred water ceremonies as they reinforce a different narrative about human-nature interactions. This is a narrative that upholds holistic views similar to that of the sacred water ceremonies. In both cases, human-nature narratives act as a way of furthering environmental conversations beyond the physical towards a deeper level, towards how people view themselves in relation to the world. So it's important to note that these groups are separate, and there are still varying views regarding the importance and emphasis of both laws and prayers. Many questions arise. Can water indeed feel the energy we send towards it? Does water actually heal and change through prayer? Will laws be a sufficient way of securing rights for nature? If we grant water its legal rights, who will speak for water? The questions continue, and I have no answers for them. What I can say is that how we talk about water is changing. And with these transformative narratives, we have the potential to change the dominant story that continues to perpetuate the water crisis. And I hope that by changing our relationship, we're laying a foundation for larger environmental change. And I think a really great example of this has been seen in Rick Kilby's new book, which is all about Florida's healing waters. And in it, he writes, if Florida's healing waters are to be healed, a paradigm shift needs to occur in the very way water is perceived. So recognizing that human beings are part of the water cycle, let me go back there, is something we've missed along the way. Water is a resource that we rely on, but as many of the ceremony participants remind me, it is also within us. So one parallel I like to draw from here is medicine. And this goes over really great with science-based crowds sometimes. So for years, religion, prayer, and meditation had little or no presence in modern Western hospitals. It's only been more recently that doctors acknowledge the role that these mindful practices have in the healing process. In a similar manner, taking this functional approach, ecologists, biologists, and other scientists must come to terms with the way people interact with the environment around them. Furthermore, scholars and environmental advocates must recognize that interaction occurs in many forms. Though it may seem far from the norm, the people who are engaging in sacred water ceremonies or the rights of nature movement, they're also working in favor of environmental protection, and they're trying to shift the paradigm. Both groups represent a rethinking of how we treat and how we interact with our water. So the first time I gave this talk, I had a older woman approach me afterwards, and she said, does this mean my water isn't safe to drink? And I realized my presentation had missed the mark. So I want you to, here's the moral of the story. It's that you have to think beyond yourself. We have to think collectively about what water means to us, to you and to me, and to the millions of others who call Florida home. And it's similar to what Cynthia Barnett spelled out in her water ethic. It's not just the water coming out of your tap or your shower or the water you use for your lawn. Those are all important parts of the story, but we also have to think about the water coming out of our neighbor's tap and being used on our neighbor's lawn. We have to think about flushing the toilet and where that goes. We have to think about the septic tanks that are leaking underground and seeping sewage into our lakes and rivers and springs and oceans. And we have to think about the industries that we are allowing into our communities and what they are taking from us. We have to think about those who don't have access to clean water, even in 2020. People who must rely on bottled water because their water or pipes or both are compromised and dirty. We have to think about water permits that are being freely distributed to bottled water companies who bottle up our resources and send them throughout the world, cutting short locals who depend on these resources. And the cycle goes on and on and on. And it's all overwhelming. But because this is our story, we don't have to tackle it alone. But we do have to start somewhere, and that means rethinking the dominant narrative. So there's one last point that I want to leave you with, and that's especially when we're thinking about the story of water in Florida. In August of this year, the TED Talk Radio Hour featured a program entitled Our Relationship with Water, which spotlighted 3 women from different places in the US and their push to re-examine their relationships with water. These include a legal expert from the Shinnecock Nation, Leslie Leonard, an artist, LaToya Ruby Frazier, who explored the lack of clean water that's still facing the people of Flint, Michigan, and a community organizer and the coordinator of Sacred Water Pilgrimages, Colette Pinchon Battle. What I want you to recognize is that Florida is joining the rest of the nation in our quest to rediscover our relationship with water. And the most important part about these narratives is that they are beyond the individual. So whether it's saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, drought, red tide, cyanobacteria, whatever it is, given Florida's growing population, its finite resources, and more specifically, its water, we will continue to experience strain. Considering such stories can provide a fresh outlook and may help the state and us as a collective to refresh our own understandings, to grapple with such climactic pressures. In this sense, the role of lived narratives and how we view our relationship with water is not only expressed through religious or spiritual dimensions, but it gives us a more holistic understanding of how to solve future problems concerning the intersections of humans and the natural world. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope we can continue these conversations. This is where I got all my lovely photos, if anyone wants to see them. A couple of them, I'd like to give a shout out to John Moran. He had a couple photos in there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that really, I think, fascinating conversation. And just as a reminder for our audience, if you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat, and I'll integrate them into our conversation now with Vicki. And one of the things I wanted to start off with, as I think we've got a couple people working on some questions, is that before we sort of came online with our conversation, we were talking about the category of religion. And that really it's a category alongside when you think about the humanities, it's a category just like history, literature, philosophy, and those sorts of things. And so I wonder if you could just take a moment and maybe um, just try to how would you explain defining the concept of religion and what's its relationship like with some of these other humanities disciplines?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Um, and I think it's very much needed. So, religion, the way I approach religion and the study of religion, I don't study theology. I study religion at a secular public university. And religion is kind of, it encompasses sociology, anthropology, political science. It kind of encompasses all of these other humanities. So sometimes people will joke of like, well, why do you need a religion department? Because you could really, history is another one that you could really take the various people who are studying in my department and put them in other areas. But I do think that religion offers a holistic understanding, a humanities lens with which to approach certain issues. And hopefully that answered Hopefully that was the good answer to your question.
No, absolutely. What I think is interesting about it from the perspective of Florida humanities is that we often sort of default occasionally to history or we default to literature. It's not very common where I think we have opportunities to bring in religion, which we do define as being a discipline of the humanities. Into some of these conversations. And so I think that's one of the ways why we appreciate this so much. And something else that really struck me in your talk and your conversation is that talking about the size of our aquifer and that it really expands beyond just sort of our borders of Florida and it goes into Georgia and Alabama. And so I guess the question I kind of have is to what extent would you say Florida's water story is not. I hate to I hate to use the pun and say that it's fluid in nature. This water story, so to speak, but it's really one where Florida's water story. It's not just about Florida. It really is interconnected with other places like Georgia, Alabama, and really more in a global context, right?
Yeah, and I think the pun is right on right there. It is very fluid. I think, one of the things that I kind of explore in my dissertation as I'm writing it is this fact that Florida is in this really interesting ecotone. It's in a transition period. So it's like it's not quite the southern, in a lot of respects it is like the American South, but in a lot of respects it's also part of Latin America. So you are getting a lot of different people here in Florida. And I think that like that's important to keep in mind, particularly when it comes to our resources, that our resources are being shared by so many different people. And it's not just even like a physical like cross state kind of thing, but recognizing that there are so many factors and so many players and so many decision makers here because water is fluid. It travels. So in the sacred water ceremonies, when people are praying for the water, they recognize it's not just Florida's water. It's a global water sense.
Mm-hmm. And that's another interesting way to think about it, that it's not just in a fixed sort of state, but that it is going to transition out of a particular location and certainly through things like evaporation and rain. And so it takes on these myriad of forms. And so, like you're saying, that's sort of incorporated into a lot of these rituals and things, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think that people are definitely mindful of that. And I think that, a lot of environmentalists, and it's not necessarily just the spiritually inclined ones, but I think a lot of environmentalists are mindful of the fact that what they do locally is also a global thing. Or, their local impact can be felt elsewhere too, right? I mean, like you just think about like the idea of like, throwing something away. Like you're never really throwing anything away. It's always going to pop up somewhere, right? So, yeah, I think being mindful of these systems is very important when we're thinking about water, when we're thinking about our relationship with it.
And speaking of relationships, one of the questions that we have from an audience member is wanting to get a sense about what sort of inspired you to connect religion and spirituality and particularly to environment. And it's a lot of lenses that I think you brought into focus on sort of this particular really fascinating story. So, I mean, is there something that sort of happened, in your childhood that started to spark these sort of connections, or is it something that sort of evolved over time for you?
Yeah, I think like when we're thinking specifically about water, I had studied religion as an undergrad, and I was very interested in religion and nature primarily because the science part, my mind doesn't work like a scientist. My mind works like a humanist, and that's why I love the humanities. But I would say that when I was working as an organizer, the idea of being far from the water, like I was living down in South Florida, and just the idea of I've always been close to the water. And I kept thinking, like, how am I going to link these passions that I have? And I realized that there are marine sanctuaries, and I was just like, why isn't anyone studying marine sanctuaries? Like the idea of sanctuary, I mean, like that's very like biblical. That's a very religious understanding of preserving something. So I kind of was like, I want to dive into that. No pun intended.
We talked about this before too,
I
that you
know.
had all these puns just sort of, at your fingertips, so to speak. And so I'm just impressed that you're able to kind of roll those in there.
Well, you used one first, so that's why I figured.
That is true. I did give you permission to start using them, so that is my fault. So another question that we kind of have is you were talking about more of these rituals, and particularly things in relation to indigenous rituals. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how some of these efforts to protect, Florida's waters, how does it coincide or intersect with sort of indigenous rights and perhaps some wisdom that we may have gained from indigenous cultures in their interactions with water? Is there something sort of to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I want to recognize, or before I answer that, I want to say there are far more qualified people to be answering this. And I also recognize that I am not in that culture. But from what I have heard of the people who do speak about those connections, it's, recognizing that life extends beyond humans, and that creator, and that the creator has a purpose for everything, right? For every living entity, for ecosystem, for water. So recognizing kind of like that approach to that worldview and that understanding, I think is very important, because it opens up, it opens up the possibilities as to like, what does it mean to care? Well, I think like, especially if you're thinking about it within other contexts, what does it mean to care for your neighbor? If your neighbor is everything, if your neighbor is, trees and water and ecosystems and animals and plants and other humans. So I think it kind of opens up that. And yeah, I think there are people who are out there doing like incredible work. There was a FIU, Florida International University, just had a talk that was called Our Talk, Our Land, and it spotlighted various indigenous leaders. And I think what was really powerful about it is the fact that, by taking away a language, by taking away a culture, you are taking the language and the culture are intertwined into the environment, right? And I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that these two things seem to go together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If that's helpful.
No, that's incredibly helpful. And I think it adds to this idea that you mentioned a couple moments ago about, you talked about sanctuaries and, in South Florida. And I think it adds to this idea that, water sanctuaries are some of these like potentially complex sites and complex places, right? And where I guess I'm going with this is that, because of COVID-19, there really is this necessity for us to not really engage with one another in indoor physical spaces, but it certainly opens the door for us to engage more with outdoor spaces. So, what would you say is sort of what's the value that someone could get by just visiting, the spring that's closest to them or the lake that's closest to them? What do you see as, perhaps it might not be just in a religious context, but some other context. But what do you get just from doing that type of an interaction?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this kind of goes back to that idea of healthcare. And, for years, like I said, meditation, prayer, that was not involved in Western healthcare until they realized, actually, this is really beneficial for people to meditate. And I think it's a similar thing that they've seen with green spaces and blue spaces. Blue spaces have not necessarily been as popular as the green spaces. There was this whole the importance of exposing children to nature, and I think that's true. I do think that there is something that it's hard to quantify. And it's similar to, when we're thinking about environmental externalities, and when we're thinking about the impact of a particular industry or of a particular project or a particular building construction site on the environment, I think that a lot of times people try to go with what they can measure, and they don't necessarily think about the externalities. So I think kind of going off of that idea, the idea of going into nature, can we really measure? Do we really know what it's doing to us? To us physically, to us mentally, to emotionally, there are these things that we might have a hard time quantifying, but they're having their impacts on us.
Mm-hmm. And I think that can also go to another question that was sort of asked, which is when it comes to water and dealing with those that have different opinions or perhaps a different worldview from what we have. And so if it's in some of those methods that you described, or perhaps it's other methods or ideas that you might employ, what do you see as some of the key strategies to reaching people that might have some slightly differing opinions? And, maybe it's just being able to have a more in-depth conversation. Maybe it's potentially changing a little bit of perspective, but how do you approach those types of situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm still trying to figure it out. I would say very carefully. I mean, because it's hard, because in one sense, and I think a lot of the people who have attended here today might recognize that the water, there is we're on a tight timeline, right? Things are changing very rapidly. And, the impact that we have on our water and our natural resources, it's going very fast. And there has, degradation can occur and has occurred very fast. So this idea, this imminent, we need to do something about it. But then also trying to bring in, Cynthia Barnett calls it the caring middle, and trying to take these people who are in the caring middle, who really do care about our resources, and nudge them to care more about our resources. And I think that's what we need to do. I mean, but I also think we need people doing I think we need a lot of people doing a lot of different things in order to move the conversation towards really protecting and really taking seriously what it means to care for our water.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that part of this ability to get people to collectively care about water is related to something that you mentioned in the middle of your presentation, which it took me a minute to process. I'm like, it was genius. And it was just this idea that, I don't remember the exact term that you used, but it's that water has this ability to record and store information. And so we talk about water stories, but water is literally this narrative that we can potentially consume. And what I'm particularly thinking of is, and you talked about in 2016 with those algae blooms, and I certainly remember that. I think a lot of Floridians do. What do you see as sort of the early narrative that's been written about those algae blooms? I mean, did we start to think about changing our relationship with water as a result of those algae blooms? I mean, are we still doing some of those same activities? What sort of happened with that event?
Yeah, I mean, I think that particularly with that event, you can't turn away when it's knocking on your door, right? When something is so blatantly in your face and disrupting your daily, your daily livelihood, I think it's hard to turn away from that. But when it's not, I think that's the time when people turn away. I think this is one of the reasons why, the aquifer, I don't think the average Floridian knows the magnitude of our aquifer. I don't think they necessarily, because it's beneath our feet. So if you can't see it, it's almost like it's not there. And I hope that, this idea of, at least it's nudging people to talk about it more. But see, the action is also, I think talking about it is very important, but then I also think, the action, as a Floridian myself, I don't want to see empty promises of people saying that they're going to protect the water, and then they offer up some kind of solution that is not really a solution, but it's almost like a facade. So that's kind of this, like, have people changed? I don't know. Like, I think the cyanobacteria is bound to happen again. I think it certainly has, as we've seen since then, right? And I think that's something that we need to grapple with. Just because it's not in the news, I think it's still something we need to grapple with. Not sure if I answered your question there.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. I think one of the last questions I'd like to ask you is, as someone who I think has interacted very extensively with water, and it almost seems mandatory to ask. Do you have a favorite water space in Florida, and what makes it a favorite water space for you?
Yes, I do have a favorite water space in Florida, and I think what makes it, I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want everybody flocking there. No, I would definitely connect more with the ocean. Like, I do think that there's something about the ocean that, like, draws me to it. And I think for me, it's this kind of it's a volatile nature, to recognize, like, I think on really stormy days, like, it can scare you. Like, you're out there in the water, and, like, if you almost drowned or you go under, or you're like me who tries to go surfing one day and decides that it didn't really work out, and you, like, get thrown for a loop a couple times, like, and you're underwater and you think, oh, I've been under here for a second. Maybe I hope I come back up, right? So there's this, like, scariness about it, but then there's also this peace that I think a lot of people find in water. And I think, I think a lot of people, whether it's a river or a spring or the ocean, lake, I think there is some kind of peace and tranquility that people find near these bodies of water too.
And I kind of suspected that was going to be your answer, that you didn't really want to reveal the specific space, but that makes sense because it does have sort of this sacred quality to it. And there's a need to sort of hold that, I think, a little bit close, but it's still just fascinating to hear that there is such a space that exists, and hopefully you have an opportunity to access that relatively soon. And so, again, I want to thank you for, I think, what has been a really fascinating conversation. I know I certainly have, more questions. There's a lot of things that I think you said have sort of washed over me. And so I'm just going to have to sort of let it, I think, digest a little bit, see if I can, get it to flow through, and hopefully be able to come up with some more ways to talk about this in a really comprehensive way. So once again, thank you for all of our attendees for tonight's program. As I said, you're going to receive a survey at the end. We really appreciate if you could fill it out. And I hope that you're all able to join us for our program tomorrow evening with Secretary of State Laurel Lee, and talking about elections. And we also have a program next week as well that should be fascinating. So thanks again for all of your attention and for your attendance. And I will see you all again soon.